Hey guys, today I'm going to show you guys my take on what I think is the best budget gaming PC in 2023 is. It's going to be around the $500 mark. I'll talk about what parts I would go with. I'll make sure the build doesn't require any BIOS updates. I'll talk about why I went with these parts. I'm pretty much just going to be spitting straight facts. We'll do some benchmarks and some stress tests and some gaming. Maybe you're a college student where funds are tight, or maybe you have a wife that doesn't let you spend money, or maybe you're divorced and you have an ex-wife that took all your money.
And this is a piece of human garbage named Tammy, who is also my ex-wife.
Whatever situation you may be in, this video is for you. And for anybody else who's looking to build a budget PC for around $500 in 2023, it's going to be pretty sicko mode. So before we get started, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. And every video I post will be more sicko mode than the last. All right, let's get to it. So the build I'm going to be talking about today costs around $505. You can get it down to about $487, and I'll explain how later. So right off the bat, I went with the Ryzen 5 5500. It's my favorite budget processor. It's the processor that restored faith in AMD for me again. It's a 6-core 12-thread processor, has a max clock speed at 4.2 gigahertz. Its TDP is only 65 watts, and it was released in 2022. So in my last video, which you should definitely watch if you haven't, I compared the 5500 with the 5600X and the 5600X 3D, and it does hold its own. It's definitely an overachiever, and I have nothing but good things to say about it. It's good. For now, if you're just starting, you can use the stock cooler. It's just not the cooler I'd recommend. It doesn't do a really good job, especially when you're doing heavy CPU workloads. For gaming, there's zero issue. Now moving on to the motherboard, I went with an MSI B450 motherboard. Right out of the box, it's compatible, so there's no BIOS update required. And for $70, you honestly can't really ask for much more. It's not the prettiest, but it'll do. Just be aware that this motherboard only has 4 CPU pins, so if you ever plan to upgrade in the future to like a Ryzen 7 that may use more than 65 watts, you'll need to upgrade to a motherboard that has at least 4 pins. And for just $4 more, this other motherboard will come with 8 pins. So just be aware when you're picking out cheap motherboards. For this build, 4 pins isn't ideal, but it'll work. Now moving on to RAM. With 16 gigs of silicone powered DDR4 3200 MHz RAM, and it's not pretty, but it'll work. Don't let people convince you that 8 gigs of RAM for gaming is enough. I've seen videos on other people's $500 builds, and they go with 8 gigs of RAM. This isn't 2008, 8 gigs of RAM is not enough. You could always upgrade with another stick, but trust me, you're gonna wanna start with 16. 8 gigs is gonna be not very sicko mode. Moving on to the SSD, I went with the 512 gig Patriot NVMe drive. Honestly, for it being an NVMe, its speeds are kinda lackluster. For less than $2, you could just go with the Crucial P3, which will double its performance. Wait, what?
Hold up, wait a minute.
You know what, F it, we're gonna upgrade to this one, which will sadly put our total up to 507. But honestly, I think it's a necessary upgrade. And I went with a 500 gig because games are so big now that a 256 gig will probably fit one big game and the OS, and that's about it. So do yourself a favor and go with a 500 gig. Now moving on to the GPU, I went with the Intel ARC A750. I was actually able to get it for $199, which would have brought the grand total down to $487 as opposed to the $507. But I kept it at $219 because during filming, that's what the price was. But anyways, I went with the A750 because I've tested it. It's proven to me that it's one of the best budget GPUs you can get in 2023, outperforming the AMD 6650 XT as well as the NVIDIA 3060. The AMD 7600 is slightly better, but this has a better price. Now the case, it's $30. Don't expect much from it. Remember, the budget's $500. It was the cheapest case I could find. It has some room for expansion, but pretty standard stuff. I would just add a fan or two just to improve airflow, or simply just open the side panel. And finally, I went with the Thermaltake 500 watt power supply. It's 80 plus rated, and it meets the recommended requirements to power the GPU. It works. Which brings the grand total to about $507. Unless you get the A750 on sale, which should bring the total down to $487. Regardless, it's around $500, which is dirt cheap for a gaming PC. Now, the real question is, how does this perform? We're gonna completely disregard everything we just talked about and talk about this build I have here. Just kidding. So this build does have a Ryzen 5 5500, and it is being cooled by the stock cooler. It does have the ARC A750. The motherboard I'm using does look way cooler, but it should offer the same performance. It's just a standard B450 board. Once you start getting to really high-end CPUs, Ryzen 7 or a Ryzen 9, you'll probably see a difference if you go with a really crappy motherboard versus a really high-end motherboard like an X570. The motherboard will be able to dissipate heat better, PCIe 4.0 speeds, power will be able to be delivered to the CPU more efficiently, but it's a Ryzen 5 5500. It doesn't even support PCIe 4.0, only uses about 65 watts of power. Doesn't really need all those extra features, so a really high-end motherboard isn't really gonna benefit the CPU. I'm using DDR4 RAM that's the same speed, it just has fancy RGB. I can turn it off if it really bothers you. I'm using a WD Blue SSD, which is the same exact speed as the Crucial P3 SSD and same storage capacity. The power supply I'm using is honestly gonna have no effect. Let's just say it does meet the 500 watt requirement for the GPU. Now the case might have an effect on temps on the CPU and the GPU, but the CPU and GPU are very low powered parts. It's not really going to make a big difference because they don't generate a lot of heat. So this build should give you a good idea of what kind of performance to expect. Just close your eyes and it's pretty much the same computer. So the first test I ran was the Cinebench test. During the multi-core test, I got a very impressive score of 10,638, completely obliterating the i3-12100F. Although with the stock cooler I hit 90 degrees, which is honestly enough to make your nuts hang pretty low, so I would recommend your next upgrade be a better cooler. And when you compare it to other 5th generation Ryzen 5s, it does hold its own, especially because it's $60 to $130 cheaper than the other Ryzen 5s. Moving on to the single core test, it still got a solid score of 1,396. The i3-12100F excels with single core speeds, which can help with gaming, but I still prefer the 5500 because it has more cores and it's just a better all-around CPU. So now let's move on from the boring stuff and let's talk about gaming. The first test I ran was Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1080p ultra settings. Throughout the test, temps for the CPU and GPU were in the 60s, which is really good. And FPS was consistently over 60 FPS, which is what I'm aiming for smooth gameplay. Now when there's scenes with a lot of detail, it did drop, but it still managed to average 68 frames per second. And remember, this is at ultra settings, so pretty happy with that FPS. The next test I ran was a Cyberpunk test. So for Cyberpunk, it's a very graphically demanding game. So at 1080p, I had to put it in low settings. And for this game being in low settings, it actually looks pretty good. Temps once again are in the 50s and 60s, which is pretty good. And I ended up averaging 65 FPS. Once again, it's above 60, which is what I was going for. Nice. The next game I ran was Red Dead Redemption 2. This game I played at medium settings at 1080p. Temps were in the 60s again, and this game was very playable. FPS was consistently a healthy number, and I even finished with a 92 FPS average, which is pretty good for a $500 build. And I finished it off with GTA 5. So I played GTA at 1080p at high settings. Temps were in the 60s and 50s. The game looked pretty good and was buttery smooth, and it didn't seem like this build struggled at all, which made the gaming experience pretty stress-free. If you're wanting a nice relaxing day at the beach in GTA 5, this build is definitely capable of giving you that. After all those tests, after all that gaming, what does this mean? I truly believe this is the best gaming machine you can get for around $500. There are other options like the Intel i3-12100F or the 13100F. Those are great options. What I like about the Ryzen 5 5500, you have 6 cores, 12 threads, as opposed to the 4 cores, 8 threads on the Intel CPUs. AM4 motherboards tend to be a little cheaper as well. I know this is just a gaming machine, but me personally, I like to have a better all-around CPU, just in case you need to dabble with heavy CPU workloads, or games that play better with more cores. Like I've said in past videos, the Ryzen 5 5500 continues to impress. It holds its own against the 5600X and the 5600X 3D, which are amazing gaming CPUs. The Intel A750 is also one of my favorite GPUs. I did make a video about it, and when I was testing it, it was outperforming the 6600 XT, the 6650 XT, as well as the 3060. You can't really go wrong there. Now, with this CPU, I would buy a better cooler. A $30 cooler would be sufficient. You don't need to spend a lot on a cooler, but I definitely recommend it. And the beauty about getting into PC building is that you're able to upgrade as you go. So if you start off with a decent platform, you're able to upgrade and you're able to enhance your gaming experience as you make more money, I guess, or as just games become more demanding. So what do I have to say to all those Intel fanboys who think I should have went with an Intel i3 12100F?
I do not want to touch his ass.
What?
Sorry, that was the wrong clip. So for you Intel fanboys.
You are stupid.
But yeah, overall, I'm very happy with the performance that these components give me. You can't really go wrong with the Ryzen 5 5500 and the Intel ARC A750 if all you need is 1080p gaming. And for $507, or $487 if you can get the GPU on sale. Regardless, for around $500, this will even impress your mom. It might even impress your mom's mom. But seriously, there isn't really a better build for $500. You can try to build one that's better for under $500, but you're gonna fail every single time. This is the best you can get, at least with current pricing. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Every video I post, I will strive to make more Sicko Mode than the last. And like always, have a Sicko Mode day.